November 1918. The guns on the Western Front finally fall silent. Armistice is the magic word, a loaded word. Did you know that most Germans still believed they were winning the war until the very end? The sudden collapse wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychic rupture. The world flipped upside down in a matter of weeks, and the old order was gone. The Kaiser abdicated, or was abdicated, and fled the country. Generals responsible for the deaths of millions suddenly handed over power to civilians, politicians who had to make peace at any cost. Sailors refused to die a hero's death, and soldiers flooded onto the streets. To navigate this complicated foundational crisis that shaped the rest of the 20th century, we're joined by Andrew Bonnell, an associate professor of history at the University of Queensland and an expert on the November Revolution. Welcome to Putschcast. I'm Oliver Heuter, and a quick hello to my co-host James Bennett, who has spent the last couple of weeks preparing for this much-anticipated episode. You're on Putschcast. Together, let's travel back in time more than 100 years. So James, 1918, most people, especially in the English-speaking world, armistice until today, the 11th of November, is a very important day in the calendar because finally the killing has stopped on the Western Front. However, did you, until this episode today, have any awareness of what happened behind the scenes on the German side of politics?
I think, like with most of the English-speaking world, that we didn't really have that much of a conception about what was happening.
Because I went to school in Germany, always loved history, hence this podcast. And of course, we did spend quite a bit of time in history lessons dealing with the immediate aftermath of World War I. But for example, the abdication of the Kaiser, which we'll be talking about today, I thought he voluntarily did that. But as we might learn today, he was more pushed than by choice. And also the republic that came about, which is still celebrated in German culture today as the first serious attempt on democracy in Germany, was more an accident than an initially planned big concept that was, thought of many, many years in advance. It really just unfolded over a certain number of days. And that's why I'm very happy to now speak to an expert who knows a lot more than we do.
Yes, thanks. Andrew Bonnell. I'm Professor of History at University of Queensland. My work is mainly on modern European history, especially German history.
And you have published a new book that came out last year that we'll be referring to throughout the interview, throughout the podcast, Revolutions in Modern German History. And we've just heard the plural there, revolutions, James. Did you know there was a number of revolutions in Germany?
Until I read Andrew's book, no. I was sort of vaguely aware of like the Kaiser's reign coming to an end in the Weimar Republic, and then obviously, the ascent of Hitler. But otherwise, no, my knowledge was pretty scant.
Because our podcast obviously has the word putsch in it. The word putsch has entered the English language in the aftermath of the beer hall putsch 1923. Do you know more about the word putsch and how commonly is it used in English? Because I still have to explain it to a lot of people.
In English, we mostly use the word coup d'etat, and so I joke to my students when I explain the concept to them that, putsch is German for coup d'etat, which is French for coup d'etat. But
borrowed from other languages, but the concept is the same. It's, can you define it for us? Is there a definition for a coup or a putsch?
Yeah, I think a revolution could be more of a mass upheaval of a significant section of the population, whereas a putsch is more a sort of grab for power often by a smaller organized group. And of course, historians still argue about the extent to which, say, the November 1917 Russian Revolution was a sort of putsch by the well-organized Bolsheviks or a mass revolution. I mean, the definitions can be fluid.
And you've just given us a perfect timeline here, Andrew, because you just mentioned the October Revolution, November, depending which calendar you go by, in Russia, exactly 1 year before. The World War was going on for 3 years. Initially, everyone thought they're home by Christmas in 1914. That didn't happen. There was a stalemate on the Western Front, millions of people dead on both sides. 1917, also America entered the war, so that shifted the dial. Not immediately, but within a few months' time, the first troops started to appear. And also the economic boost, obviously, behind the Western allies against Germany made a difference. Germans obviously thought they were on a winning streak because Russia was out of the war by late 1917. Then there was a big offensive, the Kaiserschlacht as it was called, starting in March 1918, which I think is really important to understand why this revolution later occurred. Who were the people behind this offensive? Because what many people, including myself, are not aware of is how Germany was run politically in those dying years of the war. The names Hindenburg and Ludendorff come to mind.
Yes, the commander of the German army, Field Marshal Hindenburg, and his effective deputy Ludendorff were pretty much the most powerful people in Germany from late 1916 well into late 1918. The Kaiser was once quoted that the generals were running everything and he had nothing to do except go and chop wood, he's supposed to have said once. And while you still had a parliament sitting, the German Reichstag, the German parliament is still sitting, the military have an effective veto over who is going to be the chancellor, the German prime minister. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are largely dictating the strategic policy. As you mentioned, with November 1917, the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik leadership have pledged to end the war. This is one of the greatest reasons for their success, and the discrediting of the Russian provisional government that had been in place from March to November 1917. The provisional government had tried to continue the war for various reasons. The Germans, again driven by the military leadership, the German high command is pushing for large-scale dismemberment of the western regions of the Russian Empire. So there could be a ring of German satellite states and buffer states where the Germans would control essentially the natural resources of areas like Ukraine and Poland, etc. But one of the reasons why the Russian provisional government had been reluctant to make peace with the Germans is they knew that the Germans would dictate very hard terms. So the Germans actually have to leave a very large number of troops in the east to enforce the peace settlement that is agreed by the Bolsheviks in March 1918. So this frees up some German troops for this big decisive offensive in the West. And the rationale for that is that Germany's manpower reserves are getting very low. They've pretty much called up, everyone from the age of 19 to mid-40s, and they've lost 2 million dead and a similar number wounded. And the Americans are going to start arriving in the middle of 1918, potentially inexhaustible numbers. There could be 1 million fresh troops on their way from the US, but the economic impact of America joining the war is immediate. Really, the March offensive is the German army's last attempt to get a decisive victory before they're overwhelmed by masses of fresh American troops and equipment.
It was successful at the start.
Yeah, it has initial successes, but does grind to a halt by June, July 1918, and this is also the time when American troops start to arrive.
And I just mentioned before that a lot of Germans at the time, given there was no freedom of the press or anything, actually believed they were winning. Is that accurate from your research?
Yes, no one realizes just how serious the war situation is for Germany, although there is a lot of popular unrest. In January 1918, there are anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million workers go on strike, especially in the munitions industry, starting in Berlin, but it spreads quite widely. And it's a spontaneous strike. The trade union leadership don't organize it. They try to shut it down, in fact. But the population have suffered 2 very severe winters. There's no end to the war in sight. They've seen that a revolution in Russia could just end the war for Russia. There is this sort of gradual radicalization of the working class, but even the civilian heads of the political parties are unaware of how serious Germany's military situation is in 1918, because the army very tightly control what information gets out into the public about the military situation.
Andrew, when I was reading about the history of the inception of the Weimar Republic, I read a bit about when Prince Max of Baden, It was sort of like in early October, a new government was formed. In your opinion, do you think this was a move by the military or the Kaiser, sort of a step towards parliamentary democracy, or like what were their intentions behind it?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to read the intentions. I think what is happening at the end of September 1918 is the Army Supreme Command send a General Staff Major to go and brief the Reichstag, the political party leaders of the German civilian parties, that sorry guys, that the offensive in the West has failed. The Allies are pushing on the Western Front. They've got increasingly large numbers of tanks and aircraft. Germany has like a couple of dozen tanks in the First World War. And you have all these fresh American troops arriving, and Germany's manpower resources are exhausted. By the end of September, Germany's main ally, Austria-Hungary, is starting to disintegrate. Germany's other ally, Bulgaria, is quitting the war. Bulgaria is exhausted as well. And this is when it does come to a shock to Germany's civilian political leaders that the army is saying, sorry guys, the war's basically lost. There's nothing more we can do. Now it's up to you to negotiate a peace with the Allies on as best terms as possible. The reasoning from the Army Command and the Kaiser appears to have been that, well, this is when we need to have a more liberal-looking government, which might be able to get on better with President Woodrow Wilson and the Western Allies, and might get the best deal possible. The other thing they're trying to do is, I think quite cynically, is they're flicking responsibility to the civilian politicians, saying, okay, well, we've done our bit, the war's lost. Now over to you to try and salvage what you can out of this situation.
Clean up the mess.
Yeah, and the army leaders like Ludendorff are very quick to propagate the myth that Germany didn't lose the war, it was stabbed in the back. The German government manages to negotiate an armistice, which is a ceasefire that comes into effect on 11th of November, which is 2 days after the fall of the Kaiser, which we're getting to. So the armistice is just a temporary ceasefire before there's a peace treaty negotiated at Versailles the next year.
So just hooking in there, Andrew. So we have an exhausted German army. The other middle powers are collapsing as well. The offensive wasn't successful after all, and they have now realized, Hindenburg and Ludendorff have both realized, this is lost. There's not much we can do. However, that shouldn't be our responsibility. Let's pass it on to civilian politicians. Were civilian politicians ever in charge of Germany until that day, like even prior to the war?
And this is still hotly debated by historians, and I've sort of participated in some of these debates in writing articles and book reviews. But Germany has a functioning parliament. All men over the age of 25 can vote for the national parliament, the Reichstag. But the Reichstag's powers are incredibly limited. And yes, if the government wants to change laws, it has to get the Reichstag to agree. But the main power of the Reichstag is to approve the military budget. But the German governments before 1914 managed to make the army budget something which gets agreed to for a while. It's 7 years, every 7 years and every 5 years. They managed to reduce the power of the parliament. The head of government, the chancellor, is only answerable to the emperor, the Kaiser, but not to parliament. He doesn't have to have a parliamentary majority to enjoy the confidence of the Kaiser.
So until the end of the war, it's not a constitutional monarchy as we saw it in the UK at that stage. It was a lot more authoritarian state with similar structures, but not the same strength of the parliament.
No, and the emperor has the capacity, has rights to command the army, and the army isn't answerable at all to parliament.
Okay,
and that's of course crucial during the war, where parliament are trying to formulate peace resolutions, trying to formulate bases to negotiate for peace at different stages during the war. But the army could just turn around and tell the emperor, and they do this on a couple of occasions, well, we can't work with this chancellor anymore, replace him. And the emperor just replaces him. He doesn't have to have a parliamentary majority.
Andrew, just for context, and so our listeners who may not know, could you tell us a bit about Prince Max von Baden? Because he seemed quite an interesting character to me.
Yeah, I mean, Baden in southwest Germany had the reputation of being one of the most liberal states, Imperial Germany. There was quite a strong popular democratic and liberal tradition in Baden. Prince Max von Baden is a cultivated liberal heir to the throne of the Grand Duchy of Baden. It was recently revealed by a couple of researchers that he was also had a friendly correspondence with a guy called Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was one of the biggest intellectual influences on Adolf Hitler, a sort of a very, very strange guy who was Richard Wagner's son-in-law of the famous composer Wagner, convinced racist and anti-Semite. So on the one hand, Baden has reputation of Prince Max has a reputation of being very liberal and enlightened, but he's also in touch with some of these stranger far-right nationalist individuals like Chamberlain.
And how did he end up with this crucial job, especially now that the military wants to actually hand over power?
Firstly, he's from one of Germany's ruling monarchical families, and it's useful to point out, everyone's heard of, I think, of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was also King of Prussia, so he had both crowns, the Kingdom of Prussia and the Imperial crown. But Germany has 22 monarchical families before 1918, so the German constitution is quite complex. It sort of looks very federal, although Prussia predominates, especially in military affairs. So the Allies regarded Prussia as the source of all of Germany's militarism and authoritarianism. So having a prince from Baden, which is a more liberal southwestern state, was a much better look. And in Baden also, there'd been a greater tradition of the political parties cooperating. So liberals trying to cooperate with the socialists, the social democrats, which rarely happened elsewhere in Germany. What they're trying to do is also to bring the moderate right wing of the Social Democrats into the tent, because this is the biggest party in Germany, which has been excluded from any share of government power for decades. And you now want someone who can try to bring the moderate Social Democrats into the government tent and get a broad-based coalition that will look democratic to the Allies. And Max is seen as the person who can do this.
Did he want the job?
Good question. I think he sort of is somewhat reluctant and takes it out of a sense of responsibility.
Because it's very
in
ungrateful.
The same way that Friedrich Ebert does to some extent.
Yeah, it's very ungrateful, isn't it? Like everyone wants the job in 1913 and 14, but then in 1918, when the military even admitted that there's all hope lost, like what an ungrateful role.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the situation is pretty catastrophic, and his main job is to try to make Germany look more liberal and democratic to the Allies, and to try to get the best peace terms. I mean, his main job is to try to negotiate an armistice with the Allies, and he's also trying to pull together a war cabinet that includes a couple of the more right-wing or moderate social democrats. He's really getting overtaken by events because in the West, the German army is losing territory day by day. And the next thing that happens is that even though the army leadership at the end of September say the war's lost, all we can do is make the best peace deal we can, and that's up to the civilians, the Navy wants to fight on, or if not fight on, go down in one big blaze of glory. And on the 26th of October, the Navy Command issued this order to set sail for one last battle against the British Navy, or the Allied navies by this stage, which would have been completely suicidal. The sailors twig very quickly to what's going on and don't see any sense in being the last people to get killed in the First World War. The naval mutiny starts, which so Max has 3 weeks where he's trying to manage this deteriorating military situation, signal willingness to peace to the Allies, and then the Navy start this plan for a last-ditch suicide offensive, and they don't tell Max von Baden about it. By the way, they don't inform the government what they're doing. So sort of highlights the limits of civilian power in Imperial Germany.
Andrew, was this what was known as a Kiel mutiny? Is that correct?
This is the start of the Kiel mutiny, yes.
Why was it such a sort of crucial event leading up to the revolution? What was its significance?
Well, this is really the start of the revolution, the sort of mass disobedience of the imperial in the last week of October, and the preparations for this have been going on for days. So they'd been loading live ammunition onto ships. Preparations have been going on for some time. Officers have been putting their personal affairs into order because they don't expect to come back from this battle, and they try to keep it a secret from the rank and file sailors, but of course it's very hard to keep this scale of preparations secret. And so when the first ship is supposed to, and you're talking about coal-fired steamships here, which you need stokers to keep large fires going to get the coal power, steam power from the coal. The stokers let the fires go out, and then the next few ships, sailors just refuse to board the ships. They stay on shore or they let the fires go out. And there's increasing mass disobedience in the last days of October. Then the Naval Command get loyal torpedo boat crews and Marines to arrest the mutineers. But there are so many mutineers that you're locking up the crews of your ships, and so they can't go out to sea if they don't have crews. There's this sort of mass refusal that spreads very fast from ship to ship to engage in preparations for an all-out attack on the British Navy in the Channel. Basically, the authority of the naval officers just breaks down, and of course, this then spreads because you have sailors being locked up in Kiel in military prisons. You then have large numbers of sailors and soldiers going to demand their release, and in some cases forcing their release, and attempts by officers to get loyal naval cadets or other elements to suppress this mutiny. But it just keeps escalating. Then the Admiralty sort of give up the plans for the offensive, and they disperse the fleet to different ports. And this is a sort of strategic error from the Naval Command, because you're getting boatloads of mutinous sailors then going to Cuxhaven, Hamburg, Bremen, all these other North German port cities. And wherever the sailors go, they're spreading demands for an end to the war and an abdication of the Kaiser. So the mutiny then quite quickly takes on a political aspect. But starts about 25th, 26th of October. By 4th of November, Kiel is basically in the hands of revolutionary sailors.
Just for context, this is Imperial Germany. So Kaiser Wilhelm was in charge, over 30 years by then? And again, he would have always been the Kaiser of Peace until he started World War I. And you mentioned Prussia before. This was a highly militarized society where orders are not disputed or challenged even until that very moment. Is that the society that's happening? And therefore, it was a much greater shock to the system.
Yeah, I'm very, very much so. I think during the course of 1918, there has been a case of gradual reluctance of German soldiers to carry out orders. You don't get mutinies on the scale of the French army in 1917 or the big desertions you had in the Russian army in 1916 and 17. But one German military historian, Wilhelm Deist, has argued that in the course of 1918, as the war situation gets more and more hopeless and troops get more and more demoralized, and also the troops on the Eastern Front are fraternizing with Russian soldiers who are helping to set an example of revolution to the German comrades. Wilhelm Deist has spoken about a sort of passive military strike, or a quiet military strike, with soldiers just increasingly trying to evade combat if they can do so without openly defying officers, spending more and more time in the rear areas. So there's a gradual crumbling of morale in the German army. And in the Navy, there had been protests by sailors against their very poor food. So remember that there are terrible food shortages in Germany in 1917 and 18 because of the Allied blockade. And it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of civilians are dying. In the winter of 1916-17, all there is to eat is basically turnips. You have turnips for everything. The Navy is cooped up in their ports, except for the U-boats, which have a very high casualty rate. But the high seas fleets cooped up in their ports with poor food and harsh discipline. And when they protest against the poor food in 1917, a couple of sailors are summarily executed for mutiny. So there was kind of pent-up radicalization of the Navy in particular.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by Motorcycle Rental Melbourne, your ticket to an amazing adventure on two wheels across Australia. Motorcycle Rental Melbourne is your gateway for the most spectacular way to explore the fifth continent. Visit motorcyclerentalmelbourne.com.au to check out the fleet. Don't forget to mention Putschcast for a 10% discount on your next rental. Terms and conditions apply.
We're talking to Professor Andrew Bonnell about the November Revolution 1918 in Germany. Obviously, it had implications for all of Europe and the world eventually. And here on Putschcast, we believe this revolution needs more airtime because it changed the outcome of the 20th century. We've just learned about the disastrous situation on the front. The Navy were sent on an almost Wagnerian mission, because you made a Wagner link there before, to die a last final hero's death. The High Command had the smart idea of the Navy to disperse them, spread them to different ports, which is like a spark that we so often talk about on this podcast. The powder keg is obviously there. We talked about that. But the mutiny then was the spark that was carried from city to city. And we've talked about the man at the center of it, Prince Max von Baden, who just got this ungrateful job to sort it all out, make peace in the meantime. Can I just ask, where was the Kaiser in all this?
So the Kaiser is at his field headquarters in Spa in Belgium, surrounded by the Army High Command. And that's significant for course of developments because the communications over 100 years ago between Berlin and the Kaiser's field headquarters are not great. I think there are 2 telephone lines, which didn't always work. So the Kaiser is kind of cut off from Berlin and whatever political decisions people are trying to make in Berlin.
Did he want to be cut off?
Well, he could have returned to Berlin, but he's still sort of cosplaying the role of great military commander in Belgium. Even
though he wasn't, as we've learned, because it was 2 generals running the show.
Yes.
At this point, did the Kaiser have, or do you think that he could have had the backing of the military?
I think that's crumbling away quite fast, and when the sailors in Kiel and then quickly in other North German ports are disobeying their officers. As I said, they have 2 main demands, apart from the fact they don't want to go out on a suicide mission. And the demand is immediate end to the war and abdication of the Kaiser. So the Kaiser is now heavily identified with the continuation of the war. And the example of the Russian Revolution, that the overthrow of the Tsar of Russia had been the precondition for Russia leaving the war as well.
At that stage, was it well known what happened to the royal family in Russia? In Germany?
Yes.
Did people know that?
Yes.
So just for the record, that the Bolsheviks wiped out, massacred the entire royal family, who were previously refused exile in Britain as well, which is another anecdote in history. So they knew that. So there's clearly pressure because the parallels are there. Losing the war, mutiny, it's not looking good. And even his highest supporters that owed him their positions, basically, are now doubting his authority. Back to Max von Baden. You took us to the 4th of November before. What happened in the days after?
So days after, the Social Democrats agree to send one of their members of parliament, one of their sort of prominent members of parliament, Gustav Noske, to Kiel, along with a liberal politician called Konrad Hausmann. And their job is to try to talk down the revolutionary sailors. Nosker accepts the position of being elected as governor of the city of Kiel by the revolutionary sailors and soldiers in the city, but he's really there to try to rein in the revolution and stop it spreading. This gives a temporary break in Kiel, because at the same time you have revolutionary sailors in Hamburg demanding that you have again, raising the same demands for an end to the war and abdication of the Kaiser. You can trace it day by day on the map that you go from Kiel and a few other North German coastal towns in the 4th, 5th of November, and then by the 9th you've got revolution over much of North Germany. You also have revolution breaking out in Munich on the 7th of November. This is the thing about Germany. We often tell the story just through the perspective of Berlin, because that's where the center of power is supposed to be. But Germany has 22 states plus 3 cities. They all have their own governments and 22 monarchies. In Bavaria on the 7th of November, you have a republic breaking out even before it happens in Berlin, because the independent socialist leader, then Kurt Eisner, and the socialists had split at the end of 1916 between the majority socialists who are trying to work with the existing government and the independent socialists who are calling for peace, basically, and the anti-war left of the Socialist Party that had been a mass party before 1914 with 1 million members.
I think that's important to understand, is the Social Democrats, which is similar to Labour, right, in the British world, breaking into halves, because that is crucial for what then happens as part of the revolution. So we've got the independent Social Democrats that you've just mentioned, declared a republic before Berlin did in Munich, and they had their own monarch and their own state, so that makes sense. And then simultaneously you've got the mainstream, which I assume the Western allies would also more likely talk to conventional Social Democrats. Let's call them that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And Max von Baden is trying to work with the sort of the right-wing majority faction led by Ebert and Scheidemann, Friedrich Ebert and Philipp Scheidemann, whereas the independent Social Democrats are taking a more radical anti-government stance. While you've got the sailors in the north spreading revolution from along the coast into other North German towns, you have Kurt Eisner trying to stage a big demonstration for peace in Munich, and after that peace rally, revolutionary troops go from barrack to barrack calling on other soldiers to join the revolution, to join a republic. And on the 7th of November, the King of Bavaria is told that it's not safe for him to stay in the capital anymore. King jumps in a car, goes to one of his castles in the countryside, and shortly afterwards abdicates, and this becomes a pattern that's followed in other German states. So even before the national revolution in Berlin, the Munich Revolution, interestingly, sailors play a part there too, because there were about 1,000 German sailors who'd worked with who'd served in the Austrian fleet on the Adriatic, and they were on their way home and they get out at Munich railway station and join the revolutionary soldiers who are staging the uprising. It might have happened without the reinforcement of sailors, but again, the sailors are involved.
Andrew, I'm interested to know, look, von Baden announced the Kaiser's abdication, I think, on November the 9th without his consent. Do you think that this was sort of like an attempt to save the monarchy by sacrificing the Kaiser, or was it to sort of preempt maybe like a full socialist revolution, or the things that they most feared that could be coming down the line if the monarchy wasn't in place?
On the 9th of November, we've been talking about how things are changing by the day. On the 9th of November, they're changing by the hour. And
there's no Twitter, social media. Nowadays it's almost normal that you check every hour what happened since. But back then, obviously, most things were word of mouth, I assume.
Back then, this is also, where it becomes relevant that there are two phone lines between the Chancellor's office and the Kaiser's headquarters in Belgium, because they can't even reach the Kaiser on the morning of 9th of November. So what's happening in 9th of November is you've already had the revolution breaking out in Munich and in northern coastal cities, but the Independent Social Democratic Party announces a general strike for the morning of the 9th of November, and a lot of workers had actually just done their breakfast shift. Workers in the arms industry, big arms factories in the Berlin suburbs had already done their early morning shift, and then about 8 or 9 in the morning they're starting to flock into the city centre, and so you have these mass demonstrations in the Berlin city centre calling for immediate peace and the abdication of the Kaiser. Generals, the army command in Belgium had already done a straw poll of divisional commanders. Could you order your troops to restore order on behalf of the Kaiser and restore the authority of the Kaiser? The army command's already getting the intelligence in the Western Front that there's no possibility of the military keeping the Kaiser in power. You've got mass demonstrations in Berlin. Max von Baden has been consulting with the Social Democrats, and they say, well, we'll only keep supporting the government if the Kaiser abdicates, because the Social Democrats are being told by their party organizers that, all the armaments workers in Berlin and other workers who are supporters of the Social Democrats, they want to see the Kaiser gone, and they won't accept the Crown Prince either, because the Crown Prince was known also as being a very hardline militarist, and so he isn't seen as any better. Max von Baden is toying with the idea of, can you get the Kaiser to abdicate and find someone else from the Hohenzollern family, the Prussian royal family, to rule, but there are no obvious candidates. And back in Spa in Belgium, the Kaiser is toying with the idea of, if he has to abdicate as emperor, could he stay on as King of Prussia, which would be constitutionally impossible, and also because the constitution had been designed by Otto von Bismarck in 1871 to sort of really lock in Prussian dominance of Germany. And Max von Baden can't actually reach him while all of this is going on the morning of the 9th of November. So Max then makes this announcement to try to keep some kind of command of the situation that's quickly getting out of his hands in Berlin, with all these mass demonstrations for peace and for a republic. Also, the army barracks in Berlin, increasingly troops are going over to the revolutionaries, so the situation's getting completely out of the hands of Max von Baden. And at this point, he decides that he's done all he can, and hands over to Friedrich Ebert, the majority socialist leader, because he thinks, Ebert is a moderate. He's more likely to be able to bring this situation under control than Max von Baden can.
And he's not a nobleman.
Yes.
For the first time in German history, I assume, Friedrich Ebert.
Yeah, and he'd been, one of the co-chairmen of the biggest German political party, whose members are kind of seizing power in the streets. And Noske showed in Kiel that the moderate Social Democrats were going to try and steer the revolution into a more moderate course, because Ebert and Scheidemann both sort of fear and detest a kind of Russian Bolshevik situation.
We're still in the morning here, so yeah, we're going through this. We could do a whole episode just on the 9th of November. I think it's a very historic
Pretty much,
day.
yeah.
And so Max von Baden really makes a captain's call. He does what he was asked to do, to find a peaceful way out, and he does that by undoing a monarchy that's been quite successful up until the start of the war. And he makes history. How did he do that? Did he put a news statement out in the newspapers? Or how did the Kaiser find out that he just lost his job?
Yeah, he does. He does sort of issue a proclamation, goes out as a sort of, flyer on, the government gazette that the Kaiser has abdicated, and the new chancellor will be Friedrich Ebert, the majority socialist leader.
So he handed over his own job as well, did himself out of a job. obviously didn't join the unemployment ranks, but he must have known that there won't be much of a chance for aristocracy.
Well, I mean, I forget what day it was, but in Karlsruhe, the Grand Duke, his close family member, was in the process of abandoning his palace in Karlsruhe when a group of revolutionary soldiers turn up at the front gate with a red flag, and they want to put the red flag on the palace instead of the royal standard of the Grand Duchy of or the Grand Ducal's standard of Baden. And again, the Grand Duke jumps into a car and goes to one of his other castles and eventually, is abdicating as well. And this is being repeated all over Germany, that revolutionary soldiers are turning up.
So everyone's seen the proclamation, the Kaiser's gone, history's made, everyone's hoping for peace, and then things really get out of hand.
Philipp Scheidemann is one of the key pro-government figures in the majority socialists. He actually hears that the revolutionary breakaway group from the independent socialists, the Spartacus League, was about to proclaim a socialist republic from one of the balconies of the royal palace. Is in the middle of Berlin. To get in first before Karl Liebknecht proclaims a socialist republic, which he does. Liebknecht goes on to do that. Philipp Scheidemann stands out the front of the Reichstag building, which is kind of the other end of the center of Berlin. If you know Berlin, it's about a 15-minute walk from the royal palace to the Reichstag building down the main Unter den Linden Avenue of Berlin. Scheidemann gets out in front of the Reichstag and he proclaims a German republic, but doesn't call it a socialist republic.
Kaiser hat abgedankt, Prinz Max von Baden hat seinem Reichskanzleramt im Ablauf des Eros übergeben. Alles für das Volk, alles durch das Volk. Seid einig, treu und pflichtbewusst. Die Monarchie ist zusammengebrochen. Es lebe das Neue, es lebe die Deutsche Republik.
Andrew, do you know what was the strength of public opinion at the time? Was it behind the monarchy? Was it behind a new republic? Is there anything that sort of points to what it may have been?
What sort of struck me about reading up on the history of November 1918 is that really no one wants to lift a finger to defend any of the German monarchs in November 1918. There's a sense that, the monarchy has sort of led them to disaster. People have been enduring years of hunger and deprivation and, the heavy loss of life during the war. There's, a lot written about how, successful the monarchy is in generating popular support before the First World War, although there's Social Democrats were always opposed to the cult of the monarchy. So there's just deep and almost universal disillusion with the monarchy in November 1918.
Because they weren't suffering, I assume. Their sons were officers and behind the front lines, their wives and children weren't starving. And I think it's that frustration, I guess.
No, and when the Kaiser goes to Holland, but so when he's finally told that his abdication's been announced in Berlin, and the generals tell him, look, sorry, we can't guarantee your safety anymore. Yeah. He then sets out to Dutch border initially with his royal train, gilded and gleaming, full of expensive furniture and possessions. Halfway along, he changes to a car to be less conspicuous, and the train catches up to him the next day.
I mean, it seems almost like an accidental republic, because I was reading about, I think it was Friedrich Ebert. They consolidated control very, very quickly. How did they do that, and how did they secure the army's loyalty? Because obviously the army was loyal to the Kaiser, and now all of a sudden there was this whole new system, and it seemed to happen sort of very rapidly.
Ebert is incredibly cautious. He's very much a party bureaucrat. There's some evidence that he would have actually been open in principle to a constitutional monarchy until the Germans got used to the idea of a democratic republic. The rank and file of the Social Democrats, their working class base has no interest in perpetuating the monarchy under any form, and it's hard to see that there would have been viable candidates for a German constitutional monarchy.
And just for the record, so our podcast is called Putschcast, and we haven't really spoken. We won't have time to talk about Friedrich Ebert too much. But he was not a putschist, was he? He wasn't seizing the moment like, yes, I want to become the most powerful man in the land.
No,
he wasn't.
And he and Scheidemann are kind of most worried about, as you've touched on before, what happened in Russia in November 1917, because February, March 1917, the fall of the Tsar had been followed by the creation of a coalition government led by moderate socialists. So Alexander Kerensky is a social revolutionary, one of the non-Bolshevik socialist parties in Russia. And Kerensky gets swept away by the Bolsheviks after a matter of months. And Scheidemann and Ebert are really very aware of what's been happening in Russia, and they are very afraid, just as some German monarchs might be afraid of ending up like the Tsar of Russia. Ebert and Scheidemann are worried about ending up like Kerensky and being driven out by the far left. So getting back to the question about the army, one of the leading army generals, Wilhelm Groener, who'd replaced Ludendorff, who'd resigned, rings up Ebert the day after, on the 10th of November, and says, we will back your government provided you stop any of these attempts by the soldiers' councils, which are springing up everywhere, to democratize the army and reform the officer corps. Because one of the things that you get all over Germany with the outbreak of the revolution is, on the Russian model, you have the formation of workers' and soldiers' councils. And in the Navy, it had sailors' councils.
Which is, again, the equivalent to a Soviet. That's what Soviet literally means.
Yeah, it's the same word. Yeah,
it's
the same word, Soviet in Räte in German, and councils in English. And these are kind of grassroots democratic bodies that said, okay, well, workers should manage the factories. We should have elected officers elected by the workers' councils. The left wing of the Labour movement, which is the base of the Social Democratic Party, there's a lot of sympathy for the council movement. And so the army are offering conditional support to Ebert, provided you don't try and, break the power of the officer corps, we'll support you.
Yeah, it seems to me like it was almost a containment of a revolution. Would that be correct?
Yes, I think very much so. I mean, Ebert's very much trying to, he's in a very fluid situation, which he's not comfortable with. There's the sort of dynamic which could lead to greater radicalization and things getting out of his control. And he's kind of grasping at anything which will give him greater security. And the army are offering it, but on terms.
Because civil war could have been on the cards, and it's sort of, there was elements of it for years to come after, which we'll talk about on different episodes. But was that another motivation, I guess?
I think there's that sort of fear of, the Bolshevik example. One of the things that really strikes me is, up until the 9th of November, you've got 22 dynasties collapsing in the space of a few days, going to the 10th, 11th of November. You've got the major naval mutiny. It's an extraordinarily small number of people are killed, though. Almost bloodless revolution. So in Kiel, when the naval mutiny starts, there's some shooting when Navy officers resist being disarmed. They don't want to hand over their sidearms to revolutionary sailors. They don't want to run down the Imperial flag and put up the red flag. And the number of deaths in the revolution until 9th, 10th of November is actually it's extraordinarily low. And I even argue in my book that the first act of the revolution is to save thousands of lives, because they stopped the naval offensive, which would have killed, who knows how many thousands of sailors if it had gone ahead. But that changes by December, when you have the provisional government under Ebert using right-wing troops and these sort of paramilitary volunteer groups called Freikorps to put down unrest from the far left. They don't have the people to do it.
Yeah. But do you think that sort of could have undermined the revolution in a sense? Because we're saying we're going into this sort of brave new era, but also the old elites are still in control.
I mean, this is where the big difference between the majority socialists and the independent socialists are. They both want a democratic republic, but the independent socialists, along with some of the workers' councils, are saying, okay, we've got a very fluid situation here. The old regime has collapsed, it's discredited. What we need to do is sort of put some changes in place so that when we have elections for Democratic Republic, we'll have Democrats in charge, basically. There's a push to have greater social control of industry. So you've got radical workers occupying factories in the Ruhr. But the big industrialists are very unpopular because they're seen as having made big profits out of the war. So there's a lot of popular support for socializing industry or putting it under some kind of public control. There are demands for breaking the power of the old officer corps, democratizing the army, which is largely melting away as we speak, because as soon as the Kaiser abdicates and an armistice is announced, most soldiers don't wait to be demobilized in an orderly fashion, which the army had planned for. They just get on the next train home. So the army is kind of melting away.
Andrew, in your book, you talked, I think it was about the horizon of expectations. And I was really struck by this because I thought it was, especially, with some of the things that are happening these days as well, like what people see is politically possible with a revolution, but then what often comes after it, or what actually happens. And do you think that, like, especially with the Weimar Republic, that was sort of encapsulated in that?
Yeah, I think, there's a very open situation in November 9th, when sort of power's kind of been dropped by the old regime. And Avert kind of reluctantly picks it up, but then tries to work with as much of the old regime as possible to sort of have some kind of orderly process. So you've still got a lot of the rank and file participants in the revolution and the independent socialists who've got other perspectives that, okay, Germany's been dominated by big landowners who dominated the Prussian government and the Prussian state. It's been dominated by the big industrialists and the Imperial Army. We need to break the power of these groups, and then you can have a democratic republic on a secure foundation. Whereas Avert is very reluctant to do anything until you've had national elections and a new constitution, and everything is sort of done in an orderly way. So Avert is kind of, he's a sort of bureaucrat with a very, I think also with a very highly developed sense of responsibility. I think he's almost crushed by the sense of responsibility that he's had to take on, but he sort of lacks imagination as to how things could be done differently. And in Austria, there's a very similar process of revolution with the collapse of the Habsburg dynasty and the Habsburg Empire, and it's more complex because, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is breaking up into several different states in 1918. But one of the things Austrian socialists do when they have control of Vienna is they create a workers' militia to defend the new socialist government in Vienna. And Avert doesn't try to do that. He could have tried to create a workers' militia out of the soldiers' councils, and that was actually done successfully for a while in Austria. Instead, he leans on the support which is apparently being offered by the military. But if you look ahead to March 1920, when there's a right-wing putsch, and this is another famous German putsch, the Kapp putsch of March 1920, when right-wing Freikorps troops and their political supporters seize power in Berlin, and their coup d'etat collapses within a week because of a general strike. But the army doesn't lift a finger to defend the elected government in March 1920 because they say, the Freikorps are our friends, they're our army comrades, we don't want to shoot on them. So the army proves to be a very unreliable ally to the Republican democracy. They're willing to shoot workers who are rebelling under the Spartacist flag, but they're not willing to defend the Republic against the far right.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
Andrew, you've taken us all the way up to the 10th of November before. No one got the guillotines out for the nobility, which is really surprising. Avert is now in charge. Ungrateful job again. Trying to just calm things down, collaborating with the old elites, with the army. But we still have a war going on. And we started this podcast talking about the armistice and that it's very well known. We're not quite there yet. It's still 24 hours to go. I've got the cover of the New York Times here from the 11th of November. Headlines were a new thing back then. I think they were just invented as start of World War I. Remember that from my journalism studies. And it reads, Armistice signed, end of the war. Berlin seized by revolutionists. New chancellor begs for order. Ousted Kaiser flees to Holland. This is one headline. So this is all, again, within 24 hours. People couldn't even digest all the things that have happened. So what did happen on the 11th?
The new government sends a multi-party commission. It doesn't just include socialists, it also includes the leader of the Catholic political party, the Catholic Centre Party, Matthias Erzberger, to negotiate an armistice with the Western Allies. And the armistice is a ceasefire preliminary to a peace treaty. So it's not the peace treaty, but the armistice is essentially a cessation of hostilities prior to a peace treaty. And this is then signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne in France by French military leaders and the German Armistice Commission, and is the effective end of hostilities, although it takes till the middle of 1919 before the Versailles Treaty comes into force.
Armistice, I actually also went to the good old Cambridge dictionary to look it up. What's the German word they use? They probably don't use the word armistice. What do they
the
say?
Germans would say a Waffenstillstand, the resting of arms, basically.
And James, can you just let us know what Cambridge says?
So we had a look at the Cambridge Dictionary, and an armistice is an agreement between two countries or groups at war to stop fighting for a period of time, especially to talk about possible peace.
And isn't this where the devil is in the detail? Because we also earlier talked that until those very weeks, many Germans didn't actually believe they were losing. Mm-hmm. The revolution unfolded all of a sudden, but I think people could still have thought that there is a chance of an armistice, i.e. an agreement to end the war. What the Versailles Treaty then became was a very different thing.
Yes. Desire for an end to the war, I think, is sort of, overwhelming in the German population after the sort of privations of food shortages and a loss of life. The Treaty of Versailles is still comes as a big blow, and even Philip Scheidemann, veteran social democrat, resigns as chancellor rather than sign it, and famously says, "May the hand wither that signs this treaty." So there are a couple of things that are relevant, I think, here. One is the British blockade of Germany actually remains in force until the Treaty of Versailles comes into effect. Mm. Germany is still suffering food shortages, and the British still effectively have their foot on the throat of Germany through the naval blockade until Versailles comes into force. The other thing is that there would have been hope among many Germans that now the Kaiser has gone, and the Allies always said that they were waging the war against the Kaiser and Prussian militarism and German authoritarianism and so forth. Now Germany has a new democratic government with the support of the people. Will Germany be able to get a better deal? And basically, it's not really a spoiler alert because everyone knows Germany doesn't get a better deal despite becoming a democratic republic. So the British and the French in particular have no interest in giving Germany better peace terms just because they've become a democratic republic and got rid of the Kaiser.
Andrew, as part of my research for this podcast, I had a look. I had a read of Erich Ludendorff's War Memories, and I just want to read you something that he wrote and get your views on it. So he said, "By the revolution, the Germans have made themselves pariahs among the nations, incapable of winning allies, helots in the service of foreigners and foreign capital, and deprived of all self-respect. In 20 years' time, the German people will curse the parties who now boast of having made the revolution." What are your thoughts?
I mean, Ludendorff's, of course, an interesting witness. I mean, partly, he's trying to pass responsibility to the civilians for getting the best deal possible in November 1918. He's one of the key supporters of the stab in the back legend, that Germany didn't really lose the war. They were sort of stabbed in the back by sinister forces within Germany, who often tend to be Jewish in the view of Ludendorff and other leaders of the German right. And Ludendorff is a participant in Hitler's Beer-Hall Putsch in 1923.
In fact, in German, it's called the Hitler-Ludendorff Putsch.
Yeah, giving Hitler sort of massive legitimacy in German conservative circles, and Ludendorff's completely unscathed by this. Hitler has to do a short prison term, but Ludendorff gets off entirely for leading this attempted revolution against the German state.
But I think what is so crucial about this quote is the last part in particular, James. People will curse the parties who now boast of having made the revolution. This is coming from Erich Ludendorff. This is coming from the man who's responsible for most of it, who put people like Max von Baden and later Ebert in charge, who had to sort out his mess. Because he could have made peace in 1917 and would have probably walked away with a larger Germany, millions of people still alive, and the monarchy would have been preserved. He did the opposite, but then already insinuates quite openly that those democratic parties are to wear the blame. I mean, what a coward.
Yes, there's no sense of responsibility for anything he's done, which is quite striking. What's interesting, by the way, is that the first elections for the Weimar Republic in January 1919, you often read the phrase that the Weimar Republic was a republic without Republicans. But in January 1919, 85% of Germans vote for parties that support a democratic republic. So the Social Democrats miss out on an absolute majority, but the two social democratic parties between them get about 45% of the vote, and they just miss out on a majority. The Catholic Centre Party and the Liberal Democratic Party also get very respectable votes and in 1919. So it shows, again, this going back to this question about what was popular opinion. Popular opinion was overwhelmingly in favour of a parliamentary democratic republic in January 1919. Things get worse, of course, because of the inflation that Germany undergoes in the early 1920s, and that leads to increasing disillusionment with the Weimar political parties. The inflation really started with Germany's war indebtedness, which started from August 1914, because they essentially tried to pay for the war on credit, hoping that the losers will have to pay. Well, the losers did have to pay, and it was Germany.
This is a topic we could talk on forever. We could make multiple episodes. We actually talked about it, James, beforehand. Is this enough for one episode? We're trying to squeeze it in. Andrew Bonnell, you've mentioned other ones before. You've mentioned the Spartacus Uprising, the Cup Putsch. You've mentioned the 1923 Beer-Hall Putsch. Now, Putschcast is not a German exclusive podcast, but we will get back to those. We will explore those. One thing that really struck me was that many soldiers, including Hitler, as I've read, still didn't realize Germany had lost the war until Versailles was signed. And that really helped me to understand this bitterness and the desperation that led to buying into the stab in the back myth, because they were just never communicated that things weren't going well. They were thinking they were on a winning streak until the last dying months of the war. And
even when the Treaty of Versailles is being handed down, of course the Weimar government, which had just been constituted, asks the army leadership again, do we have any military options left? And the army says, no, of course not. The British still have their blockade in force. There's no way we could get the troops out again. So again, the army says there's no alternative, but they still propagate this myth they've been betrayed. And just because we mentioned it so many times, and you've got another book written on it, for everyone who doesn't quite know, the Weimar Republic, you just said constituted. Again, why was the new German government in Weimar? Did that have to do with another coup, perhaps? Well, it's partly to avoid another coup. I mean, you have the Spartacus Uprising in January 1919. There's still a lot of worker unrest, which is being suppressed with a great deal of brutality by pro-government troops. It also, has had cultural associations, of course, with the great period of German culture in the early 19th century. But primarily it was a quiet, safe provincial town which didn't have a large radical working class population Berlin had. James, I've already given my bit of feedback, so I've really learned about the figure that is Ludendorff, which I think is not talked about enough in German history in particular. Real crucial character here, and a nasty man, I think. But James, what did you take away from what you know now?
Thanks for writing the book, Andrew. I found it sort of really interesting. I found the thesis in it about how revolutions can be contained by counter-revolutions and how that sort of led into, the rise of the 1930s and stuff like that. Reading this, and I mentioned this before, I don't know, was it a missed opportunity? Something else could have been created better, but this seemed to be a compromise which was there in order to save, people who are involved in a lot of like the disorder and the chaos anyway.
Yeah, I think some of the people who were left in positions of power and influence in 1919 assisted the Nazis coming to power in 1933. And when there was the centenary of the German Revolution of 1918, there are a number of books saying, well, actually, they did okay. They created the first German democratic republic. It was quite progressive for the time, had good social legislation, gave the votes to women. I mean, women didn't get the vote in France and Italy till after the Second World War, for example. There's been a kind of attempt to positively reassess the revolution, but I'm still in the camp of those who say that, if Avert had had more imagination and was willing to make more use of the sort of rank and file momentum for change, then they might have put the Weimar democracy on a more secure footing.
Thank you very much, Andrew Bonnell from University of Queensland. We will link your book on our website, also in the show notes. You will find a link where you can purchase the book. Again, thank you very much for your time, and we'll stay in touch. There's many more revolutions, uprisings to talk about, and if you want to find more of our revolutionary content, visit Putschcast.com. Please subscribe to us. Have you subscribed yet, Andrew?
No, but I now you've alerted me to it, I will.
There's a call to action. Thank you very much.